So first of all, my mic broke, so I'm using my integrated mic to record this, so I'm sorry for the lack of quality compared to the last video. And again, I'm sorry for the delay between the last video and this one. My life's been really hectic for about the last 6 months, and making these videos does take a rather large amount of time and effort. This time we're going to simultaneously be taking a look at both 5th generation entries in the series. Harvest Moon 64 for, of course, the Nintendo 64, and Harvest Moon Back to Nature for the PlayStation. Back when these games were actually relevant, it was actually a pretty big argument about which one was the more superior game. As you would expect, a lot of the arguments really just came down to console preference, and there wasn't any real logic involved in them. While both games are excellent entries in the franchise and both brought new things to the table that we still see in the games today, I definitely have to say that Back to Nature is the technically superior game. That said, you do tend to hear more about Harvest Moon 64, and I really think that's just because it's sold better. While Harvest Moon 64 sold an estimated 48 million copies, Back to Nature only sold about 32 million in comparison. I guess you might be able to chalk that up to the fact that Harvest Moon 64 was only the second entry in the franchise and the sequel to a Super Nintendo game, but I really don't think that mattered. Now do keep in mind that I was pretty young when these games came out, and this is all speculation and opinion, but I think the sales numbers have to do with the console's player base. The Nintendo 64 was very heavily marketed as a family system, and a family-friendly system at that. Now that does not mean that there weren't mature titles on the Nintendo 64, because there certainly were, but there definitely weren't as many as there were on PlayStation, and PlayStation gamers were more accustomed to titles like Resident Evil, Metal Gear Solid, and fighting games like Tekken. PlayStation 1 gamers also tended to be really heavy RPG fanatics. Of course, even though it's a simulation game, Harvest Moon does get lumped in with RPGs from time to time. And it's easy to see why, but even if you want to categorize Harvest Moon as a role-playing game, I think it's really easy to see that it's definitely a different type of role-playing game than what we're talking about here. Alright, so now that I've made half of the entire internet mad by asserting that one game is superior to the other, I guess I have to explain myself. Let's start with the improvements in Harvest Moon 64 since it came first. The number of growable crops in the game was increased from the whopping 4 of the SNES original to 7. You can also grow flowers in this game. Harvest Moon 64 also saw the addition of the new animal sheep. As would be expected on a sequel on a new console with new hardware and technology, the graphics are far superior to the original. The game uses small, undetailed models with a camera set at an isometric viewpoint. This actually works really well with the art style, and I think that a lot of the newer Harvest Moon games' aesthetics would be very different if this game hadn't used this. I'd definitely say that Harvest Moon 64 has a much more memorable environment than the original, and in fact it's one of the things I would say it actually has over Back to Nature as well. This is a really personal opinion. I spent a lot more time playing Harvest Moon 64 when I was younger, and I think most other people did too. Harvest Moon 64 has been featured on a lot of greatest games of all time lists, from Nintendo Power, to Game Informer, to several online as well. Pretty safe to say that Harvest Moon 64 is more well-known, more beloved, and was played longer and by more people, so of course its setting is going to be more memorable. So I'm sure anyone who's familiar with Harvest Moon at all knows that marriage is a staple of the franchise. Arguably, courting someone is just as much at the forefront of these games as raising crops and animals. There are even entries in this franchise where if you don't get married within a specific time span, the game is over. Just like the Super Nintendo game, there are 5 marriage candidates, and 2 of them are returning characters. Maybe that's confusing to you, but if you're familiar with the way the Zelda franchise works, you kind of have the same thing going on in Harvest Moon. While some of the games do take place in the same town, like the original and Harvest Moon 64, they take place at very different times. That means that any returning characters are simply descendants or spiritual reincarnations of those characters. Another new addition in Harvest Moon 64 was rivals. For each marriage candidate there is a male rival that will marry them if you don't. No, you can't marry these characters yourself. Games weren't quite as progressive back then, but this was foreshadowing. Later on in the franchise, when female protagonists became more common and they needed people to marry, the male bachelors for the female protagonist would be the rivals for the male protagonist and vice versa. However, there is still no gay marriage in Harvest Moon to this day, and I do remember that on the official Natsume forums, there was kind of an uproar when one of the more recent games came out, and people were really hoping they would include that, and when it was announced that they weren't, they kind of let Natsume know what they thought of that. It didn't really seem to have any effect, but it is a thing that fans are actively fighting for. Alright, that's enough going off script. I went off script. I need to talk about marriage candidates. So first off, spoiler warning, if you haven't played this game and you don't want anything ruined for you, um, I'm going to ruin a few things in these character introductions here. What I'm going to do is insert an annotation that you can click to skip past the spoilers. So first off, we have Ellie. Ellie works at the bakery along with Jeff, who is your rival for her. She's a really exceptionally kind character. Her plotline involves some issues with her body image, and there's also a really memorable event in this game involving the death of her grandmother. That said, Ellie's probably my personal least favorite of the bachelorettes in this game. So next up there's Maria, who is returning from Harvest Moon on the Super Nintendo, however she's very different from that rendition of her. In the first video I made about this series, I made a little joke about her being a nun and the fact that you can marry her, and that didn't make sense. So they fixed that in this game by making her not a nun, but the mayor's daughter. She does still hang out in the church in this game and plays the organ a lot, but for the most part Maria just fulfills the quintessential nerdy girl role. Which pretty much becomes the role that she fulfills in every subsequent Harvest Moon game that she appears in. Also, the postman Harris is in love with her, so if you decide to go after her, he becomes your rival. Also returning from the original game is Anne. While Anne looks exactly the same, in this game she works on a farm instead of the tool shop. Honestly, I've never really cared for Anne as a character, so I've never gone after her. All I can really tell you is that Cliff is your rival if you do. Next up we have the flower shop girl Potpourri, who is literally Nina 2.0. Like, for real, why didn't they just call her Nina? She's Nina. That's who she is. Potpourri fills out the slot for generic anime girl with pink hair. Your rival for Potpourri is Gray. I'm pretty sure Gray started the emo trend before it was actually a thing. Is there some kind of like weird rural emo variant I don't know about? Because if there is, then credit goes to Natsume. Then again, let's be real, who would take credit for that? That is an unholy abomination. Just even the concept. Oh yeah, there's also an event where she tells you that she likes you because you smell like poop and she smells like poop too. That's a thing, it's in the game. Okay, let's be honest. In terms of actual personality, Karen is probably worst girl, but she's still my favorite. Karen's parents own the vineyard, and she also works at the bar at night, and as you might guess, she's an alcoholic. Most of Karen's plotline deals with her alcoholism and her not-so-great relationship with her parents. She's pretty reminiscent of Eve from the first game in ways, and it's actually because Eve is her grandmother canonically. She's also a spoiled brat, and if you marry her, she'll just quit her job and stay at home all day. Also, she likes it doggy style. So in the case that you're not familiar with this series and you didn't catch that joke, that was a reference to a glitch in the game in which you show care in your dog repeatedly, which raises her heart levels with no effort. Speaking of glitches, this game is full of them. Just off the top of my head, I can think of about 10 glitches, about half of which are actually useful to you as a player. So yeah, Harvest Moon 64 is a legendary game, and it holds up even now if you're a fan of this style of game. Regardless of your personal feelings of the game, it is this franchise's Ocarina of Time. But that's not going to stop me from arguing that Back to Nature is still the superior game. Back to Nature runs on a similar graphics engine to Harvest Moon 64, so there is a bit more detail and a bit more fluidity. The overall presentation is just much more dynamic, and little things like changing character portraits to match the character you're talking to's mood help to give the game a more polished feel. The number of growable crops has gone all the way up to 15. While there were no major additions to livestock in this game, such as the sheep that were introduced in Harvest Moon 64, they did introduce the ability to raise fish and bees. Beekeeping is something that wouldn't return to the series for a really long time after this also. Back to Nature was also the first Harvest Moon game to have a usable kitchen. Using your crops and other items to whip up recipes that you can then use to gift to other villagers or consume to regain your stamina is now a staple of the series. Remember how I said that the setting of Harvest Moon 64 was more memorable? I do think that Back to Nature has a better overall layout for its overworld. However, the characters in that world just don't encapsulate me as much. Back to Nature reuses the characters, with a few exceptions, from Harvest Moon 64. However, a lot of their backgrounds and personalities have been changed, and many of them aren't as memorable. Remember all that stuff about Karen being an alcoholic and having a bad relationship with her parents? Well, in Back to Nature, Karen's pretty much the same, except without any real problems or personality traits aside from being a spoiled white girl. There's some other small changes, like changing Maria's name to Mary and making her the librarian's daughter. Most of the changes are arbitrary, and like I said, a lot of the plot and characters just aren't as memorable. To my knowledge, Back to Nature has a lot less glitches than Harvest Moon 64. Also, Natsume actually managed to spell their name correctly on the title screen this time. By the way, this game takes a long time to save. Like, you could probably seriously make yourself a sandwich in the time it takes to save your data. Alright, I don't want to spend too much time on Back to Nature, not to be unfair to it, but because we're going to spend a lot of time on several remakes of it in the future. In conclusion, while I do think that Back to Nature is technically superior, I also prefer Harvest Moon 64. Again, a lot of this probably boils down to which game you played more when you were younger or which console you preferred. But I also think it comes down to something else. While Back to Nature has more features as far as farming goes, Harvest Moon 64 has more memorable characters and storylines. If you're the type of Harvest Moon fan that prioritizes one of these things over the other, then there you go. If you're trying to retroactively check out this series, I definitely recommend playing both of these games though. Back to Nature is pretty easy to play since you can just buy it on the PlayStation Network if you don't want to emulate it. Harvest Moon 64, on the other hand, has become a major collector's item, can run very high prices on eBay, and has no virtual console release. Natsume has been quoted as saying that they had emulation issues with it on the Wii, but of course after everyone hacked the Wii to bits and ran homebrew on it, Harvest Moon 64 ran fine, so who knows. Next time we're going to be diving into the first 6th generation Harvest Moon game, which is kind of like diving into a pool that has no water in it and is full of pointy rocks. So, you probably noticed that this particular video was really kind of like versus-like. You know, I was kind of comparing the games, and that's not something that's going to be indicative of this entire series. You'll notice the other two videos prior in the series weren't really like that, but I felt like with these particular games I had to do that, because like that's an argument that you still even hear now. So I just felt like that was the way to do that. But anyway, definitely look forward to the next video, even though it's on a terrible, terrible game called Save the Homeland, which is my first Harvest Moon game. It's a miracle that I even played another game in this series after I played that. But yeah, again, thanks, and I hope to see you next time.